Welcome everybody. My name is Patrick Brazier. I'm the Chief Executive of Education Development Trust, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to host this session, Marginal Gains for Marginalised Girls. How can better education financing commitments really deliver gender equity in education? It's real pleasure to be able to welcome our panel here, senior policymakers from the UK and Kenya, trusted partners that we work with, and we want to really try and unpack this afternoon how you see the unprecedented financial commitments to girls' education actually delivering value for money and impact for marginalised girls. And of course, we all know that educating girls makes a huge difference, and it's not just about the difference to the individual girl child. It's actually a contribution to her long-term livelihood, it's a contribution to her family's livelihood, it's a contribution to the community. And the evidence is really strong that educating girls makes a huge contribution. So if I can turn firstly to Alicia Herbert, who is the Director of the Education, Gender and Equality Directorate at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and ask you, Alicia, the UK has significantly increased its pledges and investments in girls' education recently. As I said, the evidence is really strong that it makes a difference. So what makes girls' education a real priority now?
Thank you very much for that, Patrick. And as you rightly said, we know that the benefits of girls' education is not just for this generation of girls, but indeed, in fact, it's intergenerational. It stops poverty in its tracks, as we like to say in the FCGO. I think for us, there are three reasons why it's so important now. First, it's a pandemic. I think that we know, we've all been touched by the pandemic, and children across the world and young people have actually been touched by the pandemic. And we know that girls are disproportionately impacted. You've got the Malala Fund and others who have estimated that, millions of girls, somewhere between 10 to 20 million girls will probably not return to school. There are predictions around child marriage, there are predictions around teenage pregnancy because of the increased vulnerability of girls who are out of school. And indeed, we know that it affects their rights and freedoms today because of the violence in and around, because of the violence associated with the fact that they are out of school. So the first is because of the pandemic, we need to really put a focus and prioritize girls more than ever. The second reason for us is we've got, in the UK, we've got very strong domestic commitment to girls' education at the very heart of government. From our Prime Minister through to our Foreign Secretary, the commitment is exceptionally strong. And we've been able to use that as a platform to work and to collaborate with others in order to put girls' education on a different footing globally. Just this year, as a president of the G7, we were able to gain commitments around getting 40 million more girls into school and 20 million more reading by the age of 10 by 2026. So using that domestic commitment, deep and strong domestic commitment as a platform for international action. And then finally to say that unfortunately the caseload in terms of children living in and young people living in conflict and crisis, and girls 2.5 times more likely not to be in school in those situations. That caseload is increasing, and the most recent example we've seen, and high-profile example, is around Afghanistan. But it goes well beyond Afghanistan, and I think we're seeing a situation whereby in the case of Afghanistan and in other places where those rights and freedoms are under threat, and therefore we must give focus and priority to girls' education.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also delighted to be able to introduce Ruth Kagia, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Policy and Strategy Office of the President of Kenya. So really good to be able to have you with us today, Ruth. And I'm going to ask you three linked questions. From your perspective and your understanding of the great work that is going on in Kenya to support girls' education, what needs to change for girls and boys to have equitable access to quality education? where will you focus your investments to get the greatest return? And what evidence do you have that really of what brings the best results?
Thank you, Richard. That's quite a mouthful, but let me try to respond. What needs to change is one, more of the same, but scaling up. We are at a point where it's no longer a question of why are we making such a big fuss about girls, but how do we get equity in schools?
Right. I think.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Forgive me. So 4 things need to change. The first is you need to identify who is being left behind. Because what has happened is, as education access has become more broadened, it is very easy that you have to imagine that you've reached universality. But there are many who are being left behind. So you need to get data that is much more sensitive about identifying who is being left behind. The second one is improving the learning process. Once you get them into school, focusing on interventions that help to retain girls in school longer and to enable them to achieve higher levels of attainment. Science and mathematics, for example, making sure that schools are safe spaces, both within the school and where necessary providing boarding facilities. So having more female teachers, things we have known, but putting it as a package to improve the learning process. The third one is raising the ambition and the aspirations for girls by seeing role models. So at the policy level, as a government, we are focusing much more on appointing women into not just senior level positions, but consequential positions, so that they see there's nothing women can't do. And the final one is focusing on interlinked interventions that support girls in the final analysis. For example, focusing on nutrition, particularly for young mothers, and the intergenerational benefits that has on getting healthier children. So adolescent health and adolescent education coming together, or in a similar vein, focusing on gender-based violence. We noticed during COVID, for example, that girls were victims disproportionately of gender-based violence, particularly in homes. So looking at interventions that support girls in the broader socio-economic context that then support them in school as well. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. And I'd now like to introduce Roland Hancock. He is a partner of PwC and their education lead here in the region. Very good to have you on our panel, Roland. Value for money and reaching the hardest to reach. Those that aren't in school, children with disabilities, they're often in conflict with each other. It's the most expensive to reach the most marginalised. So what are your messages from your experience to donors and governments about investing and reaching the children who need it most?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first I wanted to unpack this question of value, because we've got a topic called marginal gain for marginalised girls, and I would argue that this is not marginal gains. This is transformational change, and just because it's in a marginal area doesn't mean it's not transformational.
Exactly.
So I would say, let's consider value as impact, and if we talk about how much impact this has, and then consider impact measured by distance travelled, then we're actually talking about the things that make the biggest difference in society. So we're not talking about things that make a small difference around the edges. We're talking about things that really have a significant impact in society, and therefore the value for money question becomes actually major change in those areas. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, let's accept that this is expensive. It is complex, but it will make a difference. So I think the sooner we accept those realities, the quicker we can move on to, okay, how do we do it? And what's the benefit for it? Now it has never been more important than it is today. As we move increasingly towards a knowledge economy, as we increasingly see that the solution to some of the problems are around education innovation, we have to make sure that everyone in society is able to access those areas, and education is the one and only solution to most of those situations. So that's the second point. If we want to talk about value for money from a quantitative perspective, we can't compare the investment in these kinds of interventions in comparison with zero. We have to compare it with the value of the cost of success against the cost of failure. And the cost of failure here, which is where we are now, is societal in terms of healthcare, in terms of length of life, in terms of crime, in terms of contribution to society, in terms of remedial education later in life. So in fact, we're not talking about a net cost in this through interventions with marginalized girls. We're talking about a beneficial change that actually costs less to the societies in which we work. So when we talk about value for money, I would switch it around and say that it's of far greater value to work with these groups than not to work with these groups. So I think that's the last point I wanted to make.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We have to make this commitment, don't we? We have to make sure that we are able to reach everyone who has the opportunity to develop their own contribution to society through education.
If I may,
of course,
just
please.
A rider to that excellent intervention, reaching marginalized girls does not necessarily have to be expensive if you work with communities. We have found out in Kenya that for the marginalized communities, when we link up with community leaders, they basically, and build on local practices to engage girls and parents in school, it actually doesn't become as expensive. A specific example perhaps I would like to share with you all is what we are doing in among the Maasai, who have traditionally made beautiful beads. And we have used the bead making process, which is culturally acceptable, turned it into a commercially viable entity, and we use those beads to bedeck the girls in lieu of female genital mutilation. So that it becomes a rite of passage that has a commercial value that is locally accepted, and then it keeps girls in school. So you're bringing a package of values that are recognizable within the community to keep girls in school.
Absolutely, and that engagement with the community,
exactly.
And the community really understanding the benefits of supporting the girls within the community is critically important. And I hope we'll have some evidence around some of that through the Girls Education Challenge Programme in Kenya a little later on in this session. Can I come back to you now, Alicia, because there are, resources are finite, and we do have to make choices, and it is important that we make choices based on our knowledge of really what works. But also, what do we know about what doesn't work? What do we know about where we should not be expending our resources because they are finite?
Yes, no, absolutely, and I think the scale and the depth of the challenge that we face is becoming kind of greater and deeper, probably by the day. Let's say on the back of the pandemic, etc. So those resources are probably particularly be they older from donor agencies or indeed from governments themselves on the back of this financial crisis. So absolutely, it is the point, and it's the case that we should be thinking about using that very wisely and on what works. So there was a piece of work that was done recently, for example, by the International Panel on Evidence for Education. That's an initiative that we've got with the World Bank and others. And they've scoped evidence across a number of different studies in different contexts. And they found that almost 50% of the interventions didn't have a positive impact on learning. Well, that's an indictment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and about 20% of those that were effective were about 9 times more effective than the average. So a very small proportion of that actually being effective. So I think that that gives us a guide, as it were, as to what works and what doesn't work. But it's not just about the research. I think as well it's about getting out there and supporting governments, national governments, where there's political will, where there's commitment, in order to test, to scale, and then to scale if that is, if that is the case. So we need to be brave as well in terms of going at what we think does work. In terms of what not to spend on, I think if you were to ask me that, in terms of the UK and FCDO, I would say not just on inputs at the margin. Because even if we support inputs into the school system through a program or through any kind of funding, then you've got to be clear about the implementation, how it's going to be used, and by whom, for example. So I think those are the sorts of things that would probably not work, at least not in isolation.
And of course, also what doesn't work is not working in partnership and understanding the local context.
No, absolutely, and I think sort of going with the grain, understanding that context, Ruth just gave an excellent example about how you can work with local contexts in order to bring about transformational change. I think getting behind initiatives like that would be quite crucial in terms of making any kind of progress.
Fantastic.
If I may, just to add to the point, I think one of the things not to do that we've seen over the course of years is introducing technology for technology's sake. And that's been a mistake that's been made in a number of different situations, in a number of different ways. What we've seen with the enforced experimentalism over the past couple of years is that where it's been essential and has been used as a great liberalizer of education and a fantastic mechanism for access, it has demonstrated that we can be far more experimental with our education systems and our tools that we have to reach those at the edges of society. So I think we now stand at a slightly different starting point from pre-pandemic, and I think there's a silver lining to this cloud, which is that our education systems and our educators are far more able to use technology in a far more positive way without shoving it down people's throats for just because they thought it was cool. Now it's really genuinely provided access to people all over the world.
Yeah, and I do think that's a really important point, because there is a sense that, and some people think that technology will solve all these problems. And exactly as you said, just adding technology on top of something that isn't working is not going to make it work. And really getting the fundamentals right and really making sure that people without access to that technology are not forgotten because the technology is being rolled out is critically important. And I think for policymakers, it's very easy, isn't it, to think that there's a great digital solution out there that is going to solve everything and we must invest in that without getting the fundamentals right. And if you don't get the fundamentals right, you won't be able to build on them from the technology. I think that is really a valid point. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Rosa Muraya, who is joining us by link from Nairobi. And if we could able to bring Rosa up on the screen. Really warm welcome to you, Rosa. Rosa is the Deputy Director of the Girls Education Challenge Programme in Kenya. This is a programme that is funded by the FCDO. It's one of the Girls Education Challenge programmes around the world and delivered by Education Development Trust in partnership with the Government of Kenya. And community engagement, amongst other things, is a really critical part of the success of that programme. So, Rosa, if I can ask you, what, from your perspective, and I think, from the practical perspective of actually engaging with 70,000 of the most disadvantaged girls across Kenya, what has been the most cost-effective investment that you have seen made in girls' education, and what has made it impactful?
Thank you so much, Richard. I think we could be here the whole day if you had to talk about what is really working from the experiences of our project. But I will highlight just a few that are really impactful. One is focusing on changing perceptions about the benefits of education for girls. and continuously raising that awareness. Well, this may seem obvious, but it is totally not the case for the marginalized communities, where illiteracy levels are high. Why is this so impactful is because carefully addressing the gaps in perceptions, and especially from a gender lens, it leads to an inherent conviction for the girls and for the community. And that's really important because with that inherent conviction, that triggers action. Like the case where Ruth had mentioned that there are localized community actions that actually support education, especially for girls. We've seen examples of men and boys who were initially antagonists for education, having the inherent conviction, are the ones who are actually raising school fees for girls. They are campaigning for return to school for girls who dropped out. So that's really impactful, low cost and sustainable. And then combining that action with programs that focus on life skills and mentorship. This helps to promote self-awareness and self-confidence for the girls, increasing their aspirations for learning. And that contributes to the spiraling effects of girls being engaged in learning and communities being engaged in supporting learning in least cost-effective ways. And in particularly having role models come into play and alumni support. Talk about examples of girls who have initially dropped out of school. They have been convinced to come back to school. They have gone through the entire schooling cycle and coming back to the same communities to provide services that are essential. They are nurses, they are teachers, they are electricians. That is really impactful and sustainable. The second example I would like to talk about is adapting a multi-sectoral approach. So we have to make education everyone's business, and in particular at system level, and then championed by the community. So local actions that can be championed by the community and are scaled at system level. One example that we have managed to embed in Kenya is a partnership with the Ministry of Health to utilize community health volunteers to facilitate school enrollment, attendance for girls, and especially for the most marginalized girls. So initially, the primary role of the health volunteers was to provide health services. So we have expanded their scope, we have expanded their roles to provide education services. What does that mean? That means community health volunteers are checking school readiness at household level. Our family is ready to take boys and girls to school. They are checking the attendance. Have the children gone to school every day in the past week? They're following up on dropouts and enabling those who have dropped out to come back to school, challenging the norms. And in particular, during this period where we've been dealing with the pandemic, these volunteers have been very, very impactful in as far as sustaining learning by making learning materials accessible to the most hard to reach. Those who could not be reached by community radios or internet connectivity, community health volunteers have come into place. So this practice is now embedded in the marginalized counties that we work with, and that has resulted to over 90% consistent school attendance for the cohort girls that we've worked with in the past 6 years. So these are really promising practices that work. And one just more example is a collaboration with the Ministry of Defense. In one of the conflict-affected regions in northern Kenya, that is Marsabit County. Ruth, you're familiar with the challenges that we face in that particular county. We have a military officer who actually volunteered to teach, because during conflict, learning is not taking place, teachers are not there, schooling cannot take place. So as a result of that partnership with the Ministry of Defense, others have begun to follow suit. So these are examples of how we can embed local community actions championed by the communities themselves, and then scaling that and embedding that at system level. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. Yes, so really impressive. So actually, if we can keep Rosa on the screen for a moment, so I can just follow up. If we can have Rosa back, thank you. Rosa, you touched on the role of community health volunteers during the pandemic. Do you want to just say a little bit more about how that worked? Because maintaining that connection with the girls and maintaining their learning through the pandemic was really critical. And I think the program used a very positive approach, a very thoughtful approach about how to engage with the community to make sure that girls who had left the cities, gone back to their communities, were still engaging with education.
Thank you, Patrick. So what actually happened in Kenya, which is big, the rest of the
Try again, Ruth. Let's see if we can get the tech working. Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Rosa? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, there was some background noise. So what happened is that most of the schools were shut down globally, and that included Kenya. And the government of Kenya, through the Ministry of Education, made incredible efforts to sustain learning through community radios, through government radio programs. Partners came in with support to technology, WhatsApp, and others. But there was a gap in terms of the most hard to reach marginalized areas. And it's where this is. And based on the prediction of so with the volunteers, we had a conversation. We have girls in our communities that have been left behind. But what we can do is actually...
Yeah, I'm sorry, Rosa, we're losing you. I am sorry about this. But we'll see if we can get you back a little later on. But again, some fantastic examples there of involving, not focusing just on education, but focusing on the broad area, the social, the health response as well, and making sure that the communities are really heavily involved in this. Moving on a little bit, I'm going to come to you in turn, if I may, to ask now, what will you be doing as a first order priority that will shift the dial for the future of girls through education? So maybe Ruth, if I can come to you first around that. From your perspective, what is the absolute priority now?
The absolute priority is you've got to get them into school first. So focusing on the bottlenecks that are keeping girls out of school in a much more proactive and focused...
Are you on?
Sorry, technology. So the first order of priority is to ensure that girls actually get into school, because you haven't started the conversation until they do. So the first order of priority is focusing in a very targeted manner at the bottlenecks that are keeping girls out of school. In a sense, we know the headline constraints, female genital mutilation, for example, cultural practices, and we'll continue working on those. But it is the more subtle constraints, whether they are attitudinal or whether it's like what has happened with COVID, where girls have been disproportionately impacted upon, the number of girls who have either dropped out of school or not gone back to school after COVID is actually double the number of boys. So looking at the more subtle constraints, we tend to celebrate the successes. Girls are performing better in national exams than girls, and it's true, but it is the subscript. So to me, a priority that we are going to challenge people like Rosa to focus on is the more subtle constraints. So dealing with those constraints. Secondly, even as at the senior policy level, we make sure that we are putting women in senior level positions, not just doing it in a general manner, making sure we are appointing women from communities that are marginalized so that they are role models in a very relevant manner. So it's sort of the second order of challenges. And then finally, looking at celebrating successes in schools that are doing well for girls and trying to make that more general. So in a sense, it's doing what we have always done, but in a much more nuanced and data-driven manner.
And I think that point about also, exactly as you just said, celebrating success in schools. I mean, we have a strong belief at Dev Trust that you can use the system to improve the system.
Exactly.
There is really good practice everywhere. And if you access that good practice, you have credibility in the environment that you're working on. And so some of the programs that we've developed around global, national leaders of education, people who have respect within the education sector, respect within their communities, they can make a really powerful contribution to improving the system beyond their own individual place. So, Alicia, turning to you around that, what do you see as the first order priority? And in terms of the funding commitments that the UK government have made, which are very exciting, and that commitment to really investing in girls' education, where are the core priorities for that for the FCDO?
Yes, so I think just, absolutely I would agree with what Ruth has said. I think at this particular juncture, and I'm probably going to borrow a fair amount of the analysis from, my friend and colleague Jaime Saavedra, but I think at the moment and at this juncture, it's about the urgency of what is being called the sort of education recovery. We have spoken a bit today about the impact of COVID on children across the world, children and young people. Girls are disproportionately impacted. I think there's something here about the urgency of that call in terms of getting a recovery on the way. And I'm not sure it's internalized everywhere across the world. It is now 2 years in, and some children have not seen a classroom. They have not even been under a tree. They have not had any interaction with any form of education at all. And the losses are not just for today, the losses are going to be intergenerational, and we're going to feel it in terms of the economics, we're going to feel it in terms of society, we're going to feel it in terms of our cohesion. So I think for me, the first order will be about that urgency, imbuing that urgency from, globally as well as, with our national partners, and really getting a credible plan in place in order to get us on that road. And we know what works. We have a clear sense now in many instances as to what works. So let's really build on that. And in terms of where the UK government will spend its funding, we will, like others, I hope we will continue to support those initiatives and those ways of doing things that we know work. We will also continue to invest in generating evidence. And indeed using that evidence to inform our own programming and our policy making, as well as use it as a global public good. So that's the sort of space that we intend to continue to operate.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And Roland, I mean, from your perspective and a slightly different perspective, both in terms of your own work and impact in this area, what do you see as the priorities? And then what would you recommend as being the priorities for funders and governments?
Well, where we come in is typically around evidence-based decision-making. So let's look at what impact our programs are having. Let's inform our policy and our program design and our measurement around what makes the biggest difference. So I would say one of the priorities we have to make now is about selectivity. Where are we going to focus? Why are we going to focus there? And how do we know that we're doing a good job? Those things are where we want to focus our attention. That sharing good practice again is one of the big parts here about building trust perhaps in the communities in which we work. So how can we get greater engagement with those programs? How can we build trust? How can we get more programs to more people at greater speed than ever before? Because post-pandemic, this has to now multiply exponentially. So this is about sharing that evidence base with as many communities as we can. And then perhaps finally, and this is from a personal perspective, I work with a small charity in Nepal which we set up for sexual health and education, and we actually ended up looking at microfinance because in terms of hierarchy of need, we needed to make sure the families which we were working with were served according to their priorities. So there are some basics which we have to put in place perhaps before we move on to the next step, and that's food and shelter and sufficient financial security in order to be able to then pursue education.
Yeah, and As we're drawing to a close then for this particular session, I don't know if there are any final points that you would want to make about the context in Kenya and you know, where you see the absolute priority now is for making sure that we effectively support girls' education.
You don't want to go to Rosa first?
Well,
So to you first.
yeah, no, well, I'll ask you first and then we'll see if we can get Rosa back.
I think, you know, we have this dilemma that post-COVID, the scale of the challenge has become magnified, as Alicia has said. So there's urgency, the numbers have increased, the intensity of the challenge has increased. But on the other hand, the resources are overstretched. And that is sort of the balancing act that becomes very important. And it cannot be either or. We've got to put more resources to girls, to education more generally, and more focused on girls' education, even if that implies spending more money on education. It cannot be either or. So to me, one of the sort of the challenges I see for policy makers, and it's been sort of the subject of a conversation we've been having with leadership in Africa, is education cannot be sacrificed. It's got to be the spear point of recovery if it's going to be sustainable. So it's putting additional money, but spending it more effectively in a more targeted manner, targeting in this case being towards girls' education.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see if we can get Rosa back. If you can try and put Rosa back on the screen for us, if she's still connected. Yeah. Okay. Hi, Rosa, are you with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm with you all the way.
Okay,
I can hear you.
So from your perspective, Rosa, and particularly from the experience of operational delivery on the ground and making a difference, what from your perspective is the first order of priority that will really shift the dial for the future of girls through education?
Thank you. So our priority as Education Development Trust is to share our vision for system scaling based on the practices that we know that work. So we have experiences and we have proven what works. The next step for us is to work with stakeholders and other actors to determine a plan for this. So Ruth, we will be picking up discussions with you on how we can make this happen, yeah? And borrowing also from other experiences that we have.
Yeah.
Around sub-Saharan Africa. So what we are recognizing now is the problem is not lack of evidence. Yeah, it's not lack of knowing what to do, because the problem is how do we put that then into implementation at scale? How does that benefit the wider children of Kenya and this world as a whole? So that really is the focus priority for us. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Rosa. So, Alicia, what would be the one core takeaway for you from this conversation?
Gosh, I think there are lots of takeaways. Maybe what I want to do is just add one more thing, and I think maybe just building a little bit on what Ruth has said in terms of the either or and about the financing gap in education, as it were. And I think that somehow in the education sector we just need to sort of come into the 21st century. I just think that the days of us kind of, £1 in, $1 in, and £1 out, $1 out, I think are well gone. I think if we look at other sectors like the health sector, where they've come up to far more innovative ways in which you can raise financing, I just think that we really need to kind of get into a different, radically different mindset in the education sector, and just kind of go bravely and look at new instruments and new ways of doing things. How do we use sovereign guarantees? How do we use outcome-based financing, for example? And I think without that, I'm not sure where we're going to get the additional financing from. Our economies have been battered all across the world, and probably will continue to be so for some time. We'll feel the kind of long-term impact of COVID. So in addition to everything I've heard today, which I think has been a fantastic discussion, I would really have a plea for for us to come out of our comfort zone, to kind of move into at least the 20th century and start thinking about how we innovate in terms of financing in education.
Absolutely. And Roland, any final thoughts from you?
No, amazing. Thank you so much for moderating. A great panel to be part of. I think there's a call really to accelerate. I think some of the themes coming out of that are do what we know works, but don't stop there. Go on from there, and the pressure is on. So there's no time for hanging around.
No, absolutely. So I think there's a passionate commitment amongst this group of people to the importance of girls' education. We need to be innovative. We need to learn from what has worked, but we all need to really focus that political will, don't we, on actually making a difference, actually taking action now. So thank you very much for all your contributions. And can we play out, please? We've got a final video to just give a little bit more flavour of the girls' education programme in Kenya. So if we can finish with that video. Thank you.
Girls in the most marginalized part of Kenya face multiple challenges that make it difficult for them to pursue their dreams through education.
It is not that easy for my mother maybe to buy these 4 books.
Evidence shows that holistic and multifaceted programming can support vulnerable girls to overcome these challenges. Education Development Trust and partners, working with the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health and Teacher Service Commission, is using such evidence through Wasichana, Wetu, Wafaulu, which literally means let our girls succeed. The project supports girls holistically across 4 key dimensions: at home, in school, within their communities, and directly with girls themselves to build their confidence and aspirations.
They also help me as a girl, whereby they provide sanitary towels.
I was poor in mathematics, but now I'm best.
The girls in our school, they have high self-esteem. They can be able to speak for themselves, which it helps them not to be abused.
CHV, Damaris, she came to our home, and more so she came when I had so many problems at that time. I was having some personal issues, and I could not even go to school that time, even though my school fees were already been paid, and I was down.
Through this project, 97% of vulnerable girls have remained in school. Learning outcomes have dramatically improved, and over 90% of girls have transitioned from primary to secondary schools or technical and vocational training institutions. This project demonstrates that strong political commitment combined with evidence-based approaches can drive enhanced equity and transform lives.
So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick.